Past few years, the Chinese government has been committing horrific acts of violence and genocide against a minority ethnic group in their own country. Here, I'll summarize what's going on, analyze the events as they relate to poverty and human capability. Then I'll look at what is wrong with the current responses and solutions, and identify potential ways to improve them. The Uyghurs are a group of about 11 million mostly Muslim Chinese people living in the Xinjiang province of western China. They're distinguished from eastern China by their religion and their language, speaking either Xinjiang or Soviet. Since 2017, at least 1 million Uyghurs have been captured and forced into camps in Xinjiang constructed by the Chinese government. The government claims that these are re-education centers, which sounds sinister enough, but the reality is even more horrifying. Stories from within the camps reveal that Uyghurs are detained, interrogated, beaten, waterboarded, and sexually abused. Even outside the camps, Uyghurs are carefully surveilled, forcibly sterilized, and exploited for labor at little to no pay. A handful of countries signed a UN letter expressing concern about the situation in Xinjiang, but many powerful countries, including the United States, did not sign. In June, Trump signed the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, imposing sanctions on foreign actors involved in the abuses in Xinjiang. While a few smaller bills have been passed, overall progress has been relatively slow. Part of the reason progress is difficult is the important economic and political relationship between the US and China. We rely heavily on China for imports, as seen in this graph, which makes negotiations more difficult. The Xinjiang province is also important to China politically, as it marks an area of relatively recent territorial expansion and contains abundant natural resources in the form of oil and mineral deposits. The actions of the Chinese government are crippling to the capabilities of hundreds of thousands of people. Those interned in the re-education camps would find it difficult to meet most of the 10 capabilities. Some of the most immediate effects of being interned are threats to life, bodily health, bodily integrity, play, and control over one's environment. However, even outside the camps, the tendency of the Chinese government to discriminate against and brainwash an entire ethnic group is damaging to practical reason, affiliation, emotion, senses, imagination, and thought as well. Those outside the camps also experience poverty. Xinjiang has the highest poverty rate of any province in China. These difficulties have led many Uyghurs to flee China, and some experts estimate that there are already around 60,000 Uyghur refugees worldwide. Even in countries that do not explicitly target them, Uyghur immigrants remain minorities, and as we've seen in readings throughout the semester, including Bourgeois and Patricia Hill Collins, minority and or immigrant status can make one a victim of systemic oppression, which further limits human capability. In America, responses from the federal government, the private sector, and the media have been inadequate to varying degrees. The federal government has been slow to recognize and act against the atrocities in China, most likely as a result of the heavy economic dependence on Chinese imports. Fortunately, however, there is growing bipartisan agreement in Washington that China needs to be held accountable for its actions. Representatives on both sides of the aisle have been quoted condemning the situation, with Democrat Amy Barra calling it a human tragedy, and Republican Ann Wagner calling it a campaign to systematically violate the fundamental human rights of the Uyghur Muslim minority. Recently, this consensus has led to the proposed Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which would require U.S. companies to guarantee that they do not use imprisoned or coerced workers in their supply chains. However, this leads to the more problematic response from America's private sector. Apple has been lobbying against the bill, as they rely heavily on Chinese manufacturing for their products and allegedly benefit from forced Uyghur labor, according to human rights reports cited by the Washington Post. As we've seen in readings throughout the semester, including Curry's piece on environmental hazards leading to wealth disparity and Walton's piece on the living wage, corporations often fail to act in ways that benefit the marginalized without government intervention. Finally, the response from the media is problematic, in that few outlets provide as much coverage as one might expect considering the gravity of the situation. If my discussions with family and friends and personal lack of knowledge prior to starting this project are any indicator, a significant number of Americans are largely unaware of the events occurring in Xinjiang. While U.S. news sources are expected to be biased towards the U.S., another factor contributing to the relatively low news coverage is the fact that China makes journalism within its borders difficult. In 2018, for example, American journalist Megha Rajagopalan was ejected from the country after hard-hitting reporting on events in Xinjiang. Despite obstacles like these, coverage of Uyghur oppression is necessary. More consistent exposure to headlines and broadcasts covering the abuses there could generate greater awareness among America's population, which in turn could increase pressure at the federal level to establish a firmer stance against the Chinese government. Because of its deep roots and the millions of people it affects, it's likely this problem will persist for years, if not decades. However, there are certainly concrete actions that can be taken to alleviate some of the struggles of the Uyghur people and put pressure on the Chinese government to cease their human rights abuses. One fairly straightforward action the U.S. could take, to begin with, is working towards an international coalition of countries who recognize China's wrongdoing and are willing to put pressure on their government. Working together with other nations is necessary to make clear the transcendent importance of the human rights abuses perpetrated in Xinjiang. Because Trump has made combating China a key element of his policy, Middlebury College China expert Jessica Teets says that anything the U.S. does on its own will only be read as yet another tactic in its desire to contain China. Building a coalition would provide a framework through which further action can be accomplished most effectively. One of the important functions of such a coalition would be to put economic pressure on China. Passing the previously discussed Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act would be a step in the right direction. Besides Apple, clothing companies like Adidas, Calvin Klein, and H&M have been reported to use Uyghur labor in their supply chains, which contributes to a steady revenue stream for China. If this revenue stream were cut off, China would have less economic incentive to intern Uyghurs. Similar bills passed by other countries in the coalition would have additional impact. In addition to the Forced Labor Prevention Act, the U.S. needs to pass a bill that prevents U.S. government agencies or American companies from contributing to the anti-Uyghur campaign. China relies on American companies like Hewlett-Packard and Intel for some of the technology that enables their citizen surveillance, and seizing these exports could make it more difficult for China to identify and intern Uyghurs in their borders. Finally, the U.S. can contribute with economic sanctions. Even though large-scale sanctions are generally symbolic in nature, restrictions on specific individuals regarding travel and study abroad can have more immediate results. If an international coalition were to be formed, another important function could be to uncover clear evidence of China's wrongs through each country's intelligence agency, and publicize damning information. Perhaps, according to former Pentagon official Chip Gregson, China's knowledge that we are documenting their crimes will be its own deterrent to continuing these crimes. Besides governments, the media can also play an important role in exposing these wrongs. Persistent coverage could inform the public and cause embarrassment for China. While putting pressure on China is likely the only way to end the suffering of the Uyghurs in the long term, it is also important to alleviate the short-term suffering of individual Uyghurs. Under the Trump administration, the U.S. has capped the number of refugees it will accept at 18,000, the fewest in history. As one of the wealthiest nations in the world, the U.S. has the capacity to provide a better standard of living for many of these refugees, and doing so could prove greatly beneficial. Finally, humanitarian aid organizations provide a way for individuals to help the Uyghur cause. The Uyghur Human Rights Project lists 3 goals toward which they put donated funds. They strive to provide emergency humanitarian relief for Uyghur refugees, interview concentration camp survivors and help tell their stories to the world, and campaign to end business as usual while Uyghurs are suffering crimes against humanity. As much as I disagree with Peter Singer, the class reading from him is applicable here. Individual giving to alleviate human suffering is indeed morally necessary, and likely to create impact if done on a large scale by a large number of people. Ultimately, this issue is large and important enough that a wide range of citizens and organizations across the globe will need to contribute to its solution. The extreme poverty and capability crisis created by internment camps and discrimination in Xinjiang and emigration out of Xinjiang will require a combination of the efforts of corporations and governments alike. It cannot be tolerated.